Welcome to this webinar, Transforming Compliance for Financial Services Providers. I specifically arranged this webinar as a result of feedback that I had from a survey I did earlier in the year dealing with compliance topics, and it was quite interesting and quite obvious that there was an issue out there in terms of managing compliance and communicating the role of compliance within organisations, and so I've developed this webinar hopefully to deal with those questions. So the agenda for today is how to efficiently deliver compliance services that makes the board and the CEO comfortable. As I said, some of the questions dealt with getting support from senior management and the board for compliance services. How to identify compliance gain points, what compliance can do to add value to their role, what compliance can do to educate internal customers about what compliance does, and get them to involve compliance in the organisation, and to understand the most important driver of long-term compliance for your business. And I'm going to allow at least 10 minutes at the end for questions and answers, and so that hopefully I can answer any questions that you want to ask that I haven't already answered during the webinar. Just quickly about me, some of you will have known me for quite some time, others perhaps for a lesser time. I'm a lawyer, but today is not so much about the legal content, although there's perhaps some legal interpretation of some of the issues that financial services providers are facing, but it's more about some of the things that I've seen in some clients and other people that I think are relevant to compliance. Also, I've had experience as a professional services manager, a trainer and facilitator, and also I do provide expert reports, and in that capacity where I've been asked to report on an organisation that's had to give an undertaking to ASIC or the ACCC, I've seen some of the procedures and processes in place in those sorts of organisations, and so that is been of interest. And also I'm a director of a public company, which is a healthcare provider, and I'm on the risk committee of that company, and I think that that has given me some experience and ideas in this area as well. So just setting the scene in terms of the current financial services scene. Absolutely no doubt about it, there's pressure on compliance and pressure on all financial services providers to do more with less, pressure from shareholder point of view, pressure from customers to provide services more efficiently, and that pressure reflects on the compliance part of any business. And absolutely no doubt there's ongoing bad publicity for banking, insurance and financial services, from the politicians, from the media, and an impact and criticism on financial services compliance culture. The other couple of events that have occurred more recently, a proposal from AUSTRAC to amend the AML-CTF rules to actually specify the role and requirements of a AML compliance officer, and in my opinion that step puts more pressure on compliance officers in reporting entities. The other recent event is the announcement by the government of the Banking Executive Accountability Regime, which isn't just limited to banks, it applies to all authorised deposit-taking institutions, and reflects a broader push for accountability of executives of financial service providers in terms of being responsible for breaches that occur in their organisation, both in terms of accountability, in terms of actual employment, discipline, and potentially fines. So that regime is going to place more pressure on boards and senior managers to require compliance to be able to certify to them that all is in order within their organisation, and then compounded with increased regulator enforcement activity. We're seeing increased budgets for ASIC and APRA and the ACCC. The Privacy Commissioner from February next year will have greater powers in respect of the data breach notification scheme, and AUSTRAC is also going to have greater powers. And in fact, if you missed it, just the recent announcement is that AUSTRAC will be moved from the Attorney General's Department to Home Affairs, where it'll be part of a broader national security program. So we'll expect to see more from AUSTRAC. And all of that is combined with increased penalties. So the penalty unit regime has seen the amount of a penalty unit increase, so that a corporate penalty these days, a typical corporate penalty for a breach of a range of laws, is now over the $2 million mark. And what we're also seeing is the fines that are being imposed by the courts for things like misleading advertising are now being linked to the profits that are being made as a result of the breach. So we're seeing that, for example, in the case of Apple recently, and Optus as well, when they breached the ASIC Act and the Consumer Protection Act, the fines were a percentage of the profits they made as a result of the misleading advertising. So current compliance pains, we're seeing, and I'm seeing clients talk to me about lack of resources, sometimes low influence they have in the organisation. Sometimes I'm seeing that the processes they've got aren't fit for what they're required to do, or they're not being updated. Perhaps reports they produce aren't being considered by the board. Sometimes failures they raise aren't being escalated to senior managers or the board as should be occurring. Sometimes there's inadequate training of both compliance staff and the business staff. There's a tendency perhaps to look for IT solutions as solutions for compliance, although, as I'll talk about it later, technology certainly is a help in terms of automating compliance functions. Sometimes there's a failure to identify gaps in compliance between different business divisions, business functions, and certainly in the bigger organisations, the insurers and the banks, we're seeing problems with what they call silos, where they have big divisions which don't talk to each other, and therefore no overarching compliance supervision of the whole organisation. What the government and politicians have been complaining about is an inconsistent approach to corrective action and discipline. So certainly the parliamentary committees have been asking the senior bank executives as to why no one has been dismissed as a result of some of the scandals that have occurred. So there's an issue in terms of how you discipline someone who commits a breach within an organisation. And certainly I think certainly this, as far as the banks are concerned, they've underestimated the regulators and the politicians, underestimated the will for them to deal with some of the compliance issues that have come up. So let's just have a look at the goal of compliance so we can see what compliance is expected to do and how it's actually achieving its goal. Certainly the fundamental goal of compliance is to prevent and define breaches, and I'll talk about that shortly. And part of that is definitely to decrease risk in the organisation and hopefully to increase productivity and achieve a sustainable organisation. The other function of compliance is to protect the license that you have. So if you've got a financial services license, a credit license, banking authority, they're fundamental to your business, and part of those licenses requires you to comply with the conditions imposed by ASIC and APRA, if you're APRA regulated. And the role of compliance is to make sure that those conditions are met. And certainly if there's a breach, the important role of compliance is to respond and fix that breach. It's always an interesting argument as to whether there's a cost-benefit analysis appropriate to compliance. But certainly my argument today will be that a lot of compliance doesn't cost any money, and it shouldn't be a situation where risk is decreased if more money is spent on compliance, or that risk is increased if less money is spent on compliance. They should be unrelated, but certainly there are things that need to occur for risk to decrease in an organisation, and they involve the approach to compliance. And one of those, and most importantly, is values in the organisation, and that comes back to this issue of culture. The most important element of compliance costs nothing, and is really part of your organisation's brand. So if you've got a brand which says we're going to be customer focused, or we are focusing on a particular part of the community, then the important thing is that you're serious about that within the whole organisation. Everything you do must be focused on that brand, and that includes compliance. So these values and brands aren't just aspirations, they should be embedded in everything that's done, and it should be embedded in compliance. And the whole organisation needs to understand that if you're going to meet your conduct aims and your focus on your customers, then that includes compliance. And so that means that what we call conduct risk is important. It means that if you're developing a product, then it's got to be of benefit to the customer. If you're going to deal with a customer in terms of complaints or disputes, then you have to understand that you know, the customer is at the heart of what you do, and you need to come up with a solution that is of benefit to the customer. And so the real benefits of compliance are going to come through those cultural issues and how you deal both internally and externally with your customers. The interesting thing is that, and it's a bit trite to say, you know, everything is a journey, but certainly what I have seen is that perhaps organisations who've got a financial services licence in 2004 or a credit licence in 2010 perhaps haven't evolved the way they should have evolved in the intervening period. So you know, it's more than nearly 13 years now since financial services licence started, and credit licensing started over 5 years ago, and a lot of plans that are in place perhaps haven't kept up to date with the changes. A lot of plans that were created as part of licence applications perhaps weren't implemented the way they should have been, and certainly some of them haven't been updated, and certainly aren't as effective as they could be in the current climate. So they're not necessarily risk focused, but were at the time done to obtain a licence, and haven't been developed since then. And certainly I've seen questions come up from clients who talked about particular processes and have defended them on the basis they've always done it that way, but where the problem is that it was done that way perhaps in 2005, but things changed and haven't been changed, and the processes haven't been changed. So perhaps the question for some of these processes should be, well, what if we didn't do it that way, and look at whether or not those processes have decayed or are no longer appropriate. So compliance is ongoing, and you cannot ever say to your board, that no further things are required to be done, and everything's up to date, perhaps, but there are always compliance issues that are going to arise. So, from the compliance officer's point of view, what's the perfect day for a compliance officer? Certainly, what I have seen lately is some compliance officers complain about what I call job description creep. So in the effort to do more for less, perhaps compliance officers are being asked to do things outside their original job description. And I've certainly seen job ads recently for compliance officers which are quite extensive in terms of being up to date with all the law, being able to deal with risk issues, being able to look at strategic projects, and a whole range of things which perhaps should involve a team rather than one person or multiple people. So, and it depends too how many reports you need to do, because if you're reporting to AUSTRAC as well as ASIC for credit and financial services, and there are privacy issues, there's a range of things that need to be done, as well as the business attending to business queries. So there's business as usual issues, queries from the business itself, as well as special projects involving new technology implementation, perhaps, or projects for implementation of regulatory changes. There are always ongoing things, and I suspect that a lot of compliance officers are trying to keep up, and certainly my proposition is that you need to focus on the important things and set up processes to deal with other things. Certainly, there's numerous laws that apply and regulations that apply in the financial services sector, and it's going to be a matter of finding the best way to implement compliance with those laws, and I'll suggest some of those ways as we go through the morning, so you can get some gains and relieve some of the pain. The 3 lines of defence. If you're an APRA regulated organisation, you'll be familiar with this. I think the first thing that I think that some people have perhaps a misunderstanding about it is the fact that the first line of defence is the business itself, and I think that the issue is the importance for the business itself to own the risk, and it's done in a number of different ways as to whether you embed a compliance person in the business or whether you train up business staff to understand some of the compliance issues. But certainly the business itself is the first line of defence, with risk management and compliance team as the second line of defence, designed to review and challenge what goes on in the business and to raise issues, and the third line of defence is the internal auditor, and then the external auditor and external experts. Some of you will be familiar with this diagram of mine. I originally started drawing this when financial services licence first came in, and it's been developing ever since. But what it does show is the elements in a compliance framework. And whilst I would have liked to put the customer at the centre of it, the customer is on the second column from the right, second row from the bottom, but the customer ideally would be the focus of it. But and if you look at the customer, You can see that the customer deals with operations, HR provides training support to operations, marketing provides support there, and perhaps sometimes a lot of the sales come through marketing. But then the customer may make complaints or raise disputes, and the issue then is how the compliance team deals with that, whether it then looks at those complaints for systemic issues, and at the same time the compliance team needs to deal with the business issues that arise from time to time by operations. The compliance officer needs resources to do all that. It needs to keep records, needs to make reports, and you can see on the left-hand column the compliance officer will make reports to the Chief Risk Officer, who reports up to the Risk and Audit Committee, who deals with the internal auditor, and the Risk and Audit Committee will make reports up to the board, which has to make an annual report. If it's an APRA-regulated organisation, has to make an annual risk management declaration. At the same time, there's a responsible manager, who I'll talk about shortly, who deals with the CEO. The CEO is responsible for making annual compliance certificates to ASIC, both for credit and financial services. And in the middle of all that, there's a possibility of external dispute resolution being required. External auditors will give their input. There might be a whistleblower who will cause problems, and as you can see on the top right, there's the regulators. So there are a number of components in the compliance framework, and every organisation will be different. It's theoretically scalable, and every organisation has a different framework, but the elements I think are fairly consistent. And as I said, every organisation will be different. Every organisation will have its own organisation chart, but it's important that you have a chart. The first thing is you have a chart, and so you can see who's responsible for what, and then you can follow that with job description. So it doesn't matter whether you have a formal structure or a less formal structure, and it is actually important to have an organisation chart so you can show who is responsible for what. The importance of job descriptions is that it embeds compliance at the operational level. So as I said before, the first line of defence is the business itself, and business won't take responsibility for compliance unless it's part of their job. So it needs to be in their job description, and it's fairly trite to say that everyone is responsible for compliance. And I read somewhere recently, well, it's like having a dog. Everybody's responsible for the pet of the house, but only one person feeds it. And in an organisation, one person perhaps is accountable for compliance, and that's going to be the senior managers or the chief risk officer. But everybody's responsible for compliance in an organisation, as I said, in terms of carrying out the culture and your brand, and what you do within the organisation. Ideally, the job description and the compliance interaction with the business should focus on information relevant to that person's job. So if a person's involved in credit or giving financial advice, then the information they need that's relevant to compliance is relevant to the risks they face in that job. Excuse me. So the role of compliance is, in terms of the business, is to be able to understand what the person at the first line needs to do to be able to succeed, and what they need to know what not to do, and that's really an important part of the first line of defence and the assistance that compliance can provide to them. And information's got to be easy to find. It's no good being in folders in a library. It can be on an intranet. It can be on a wiki, an externally hosted database. But it's got to be easy to find. It's got to be relevant to the person doing their job. just want to talk briefly about the Chief Risk Officer. As I said, for APRA-regulated organisations, they're required to have a Chief Risk Officer unless they're, they're too small or there's a reason for it. But essentially, the Chief Risk Officer is the person who has the authority to challenge the business in respect of things that affect the business's risk. So that's the second line of defence. And if it can be done, depending on the size of the organisation, they should be independent from the business and finance. But they need to have, and whoever it is that's involved needs to have an oversight of the whole business. As I said before, the risk of silos is that separate business divisions operate without an oversight, without an overarching understanding of the risks. So you could have a particular division doing things on its own and without the holding company or central business management understanding what's been going on in that organisation. I want to talk briefly about responsible managers and what their responsibilities are, because often the responsible managers are people, and they're supposed to be people who make business decisions in terms of operations, and that's the requirement from ASIC in terms of credit licenses and financial services licenses, that the responsible manager is the person who makes the decisions in respect of business products. The difficulty is that often responsible managers sometimes either don't know that they're a responsible manager in terms of the financial services or credit license, and doesn't necessarily know what they have to do in terms of their role as responsible manager. So their role as a senior manager of a business division may not explicitly say, and by the way, you are the responsible manager on our ASIC license. And the object of a responsible manager is to understand who's responsible for managing system errors that occur, software glitches, if ATMs go down, if client service platforms don't work the way they're supposed to work, if ads are misleading, then they need to understand who's responsible for that. Is it the business? Is it someone central? Is it IT? Is it compliance? And that's where their compliance role comes in. They need to be copied in to compliance issues that affect their business. They need to liaise with other business division managers so they understand that there might be a compliance issue occurring in another business division which may affect them that they may not be aware of. And they need to keep their training up to date. So, having said all of that, I think what I'd like to do is give you some indication of how you can do some of those things, and I'll go through some of these issues, and perhaps they'll be of benefit to you. There we go. That's great. The first thing, and it might seem obvious, I'm talking about quality control. I don't care what you call it within your organisation, but it's certainly standard operating procedures and processes. And if you have standard operating procedures, then you're able to deal with a lot of the compliance issues very efficiently, and you focus on how the business functions rather than perhaps from a legal standpoint. And the idea is to look at the business process, and I'll talk about that in a moment. To do that, you need to know your business. You really need to understand the products or services your business provides, and you can understand then what laws and regulations and issues affect the business. And to provide these sort of services, you can use all sorts of tools and checklists. You need to record keep. You've got to document everything. As far as the regulators are concerned, ASIC and APRA are concerned, if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. It hasn't happened. And you need these days to look at compliance from a number of channels. So it's not just branches, it's not just electronically, internet banking, social media, services, different apps. You need to have compliance and processes that deal with all those channels. And your internal auditors and external auditors need to understand that and be able to, as the third line of defence, need to be able to assist with that process. Basically, standard operating procedure says what it is, what it relates to, why it's important, when does it need to be done, who's responsible to do it, and how to successfully complete the task. And if you've got that, then certainly you're going to be efficient, and you're going to be able to decide at what level that needs to be done and what the cost of doing it will be. So this is not my original concept, the concept of DOCAS. Once you've looked at your process, you can look at whether or not it can be delegated, outsourced, continued, automated, or stopped, because there may be things that, as I said before, processes that are no longer relevant because the law has changed or because different ways have been found to do it. This is just a clip from a spreadsheet that I've seen, but essentially what it does is it starts the process because it looks at an individual person, looks at the task they're currently doing, looks at whether or not it's going to be delegated or outsourced or continued, looks at, in this case, it says it's going to be delegated, who's it going to be delegated to, is there a written procedure, when is it going to be completed by, it's going to be handed over to someone else to do, and how it's going to be handled on an ongoing basis. So the importance of this process is that you can actually look at your resources, you can look at what you have to do, and understand whether or not, as I said, to be continued or not. So looking at your processes from a financial services point of view, certainly you'll have your own flow charts in terms of how your business operates, but seems to me these processes can apply to new products in terms of new product development, in terms of marketing, competitions, in terms of the website, how they, which part of the organisation is responsible for them, how they monitored in terms of compliance, and who supervises it, and who's responsible for fixing it if something goes wrong, if the website has a glitch, or if there's an error on the website, is it a marketing function, or is it a IT function, or is it a compliance function? Who's responsible for these things? With financial services disclosures, you're familiar with all the disclosure documents, so you need to have a look and see, are your disclosure documents up to date? Who's responsible for reviewing them? When do you review them? And what is the process for that? And who makes sure that the up-to-date disclosure documents go out to branches? Who's responsible for making sure they go out to the website? A range of things relate to disclosures. New customer onboarding. There are obviously ID issues. These days, a lot of onboarding financial service providers are trying to do that electronically. There are a range of issues associated with onboarding, whether it's done in the branch or electronically. Account opening, product terms, there should be a process for that, and compliance should have an involvement in that. Credit advice, if you're giving financial advice, administration, things like statement errors, issuing statements, estates, if you've got customers coming to you about estates, administration of estates, powers of attorney. You should have processes for all those things, and some of them should be fairly straightforward. Collections is heavily regulated. You need processes for that. Yes, you can outsource the actual collection, but you need to know the compliance rules in terms of collections, in terms of dealing with customers, in terms of financial hardship, how you deal with complaints and disputes, how you deal with your external dispute resolution scheme. You need to have a process for that. It can't be just made up each time, and it needs to be dealt with consistently. It needs to be reported on, so your process needs to deal with internal reporting and whether these complaints are resolved, whether they're escalated to disputes, how disputes are resolved, and then if those disputes involve a breach and you've identified a breach, breach reporting, whether it needs to be reported to ASIC, how it gets reported to your Risk and Audit Committee. Those issues you need processes for, and then you need processes for regulatory investigations and notices you receive, either from the tax office or ASIC or the ACCC. If someone rocks up to your front counter, do you have a process for that? So a whole range of processes you should have, and ideally they should be linked to the job, the person doing the job, or be easily accessible. And the benefit of documented processes is that it frees you up to add value to a matter when you need to. You know, so that if there's an unusually complex matter comes up, you don't need to be worrying about the day-to-day matters. You can bring in new staff if you need to. You can delegate it to someone, and they can see what the process is. As I said, it helps with delegation, ongoing management. It helps with review. So if you're doing a review of a process, if it's documented, you can see whether it's still effective, if it's unnecessary or out of date. If you've got processes, then it's easier to automate them, and things that are repeatable can be automated. So once you've got an up-to-date process, and automating can be extremely simple. It can be something that is either as part of Outlook, an email auto response, or it can be more complicated than that. But there are incredible tools available these days to automate correspondence or to generate forms that need to be sent to customers, or to check things that come from the business. So tools to drive compliance, as I said, include compliance in all job descriptions. Training is critical, and training at the business level is an important aspect of compliance. Checklists, doesn't matter whether they're electronic or paper, checklists are always helpful to make sure things aren't overlooked. You can put them on the front of a hard paper file, or have them on an Excel spreadsheet. Incentives are important in the sense that you shouldn't be giving incentives to people who don't take compliance seriously. And on the other hand, people who deliberately breach compliance or deliberately do not attend training that's required should be disciplined in some way. So compliance should be monitored. There can be mystery shopping. Mystery shopping can be done without it being a punitive thing. It can be done just in terms of seeing how your frontline staff are performing, and it can be a helpful tool, and certainly audits are always helpful. Next thing I want to talk about is project management, and whilst again that might seem fairly obvious, workflow can be a really efficient tool, as can ticketing. And what I mean by ticketing is when jobs come into compliance, when things are referred to compliance, you need to manage that in terms of priority, and I'll talk about that shortly. Responsible managers need to understand the volume of work you're getting. So whether it's a business as usual job, a small marketing review, or whether it's a major new project, the business needs to know what you're doing. And then once the project is completed, then you can transition that to business as usual, and you can help train the business in understanding the compliance issues. So, as I said, compliance sometimes, the feedback I get, is sometimes there's just too much coming in, and you need to, say, perhaps explain why a project has been delayed, and because there's a range of business as usual work, smaller queries coming in, up to a major complex matter, and there's pressure from all directions to get stuff done. Project management, there are some basic ways of dealing with it, but one of the ways that I've seen is analyse it, visualise it, prioritise, iterate, complete, review and reflect. So basically, I'll talk about those in a bit more detail now. The idea is to put some order into chaos, reduce anxiety, enable you to carry out your compliance role better. So analysing means spending time planning at the beginning of the project to save time later. And if you've read anything about resolving the mountain or the flow of stuff coming into your email box or getting things done, the idea is to look at something first and then try to make an assessment of something that can be done straight away or needs to be dealt with in a proper manner. Look at what other things that need to be done before you can do that thing, what the dependencies are, can it be delegated, should it be outsourced. Look at when it should be done by. You look at when you'll get something, will they tell you from internally, from another business division, will they tell you when it needs to be done, or are there a series of things that need to be done? Can it be done in smaller chunks? So you need to look at what you have to do, and how much effort's required, not necessarily how much time is required, but whether it requires meetings, does it require a number of people to be involved. Look at how much effort is involved in doing the thing they've been asked to do. And you need to tell your senior managers and the board exactly, both in terms of bigger projects, but also the whole scope of work that you're doing. And you need to record that, and I'll talk about that in a moment. You need to visualise the amount of work that you've got. So there's a tool called the Kanban, which is a simple whiteboard with stickers to show what you're going to do, what you're currently doing, how much has been completed, and some people find that helpful. And there's online tools like Trello, which basically simulates that sort of a tool where you can see little cards going from left to right, showing who's working on what the priorities are, what the current projects are, what's completed, so that sort of a tool is quite helpful. There are a range of different online tools, and they have the same principle as to help you manage what's going on, and also to show visually what's going on, and that's a helpful tool. I think it's fairly obvious that if you do what adds value first, then you take a lot of pressure off yourself and you get some runs on the board. What gets the biggest payoff? So if there's a major project, then there's something that's part of it. You look at that and say, well, if I can do that first, then that's going to be immediately functional. But as I said, there's going to be a range of things that you're going to get, from smaller marketing sign-offs to bigger projects, and it's a matter of managing that and understanding, well, can the small things be done in the business, or if I delegate it to someone else, and I'll work on the larger things. So it's a question of prioritising. And as I said, sometimes it might be something you need to do in stages. So is there a minimum viable product or minimum thing you can do to get initial feedback? Not necessarily an inferior response, but basically you just look at it and say, well, I really, do I need to get more information? Is this what you're looking for? And manage the project that way. It can be a series of drafts of a document. You can be looking at a response in a range of ways, not necessarily a finished product first, which may not be what the person in the business wants from you anyway. And you need to know, if things are being passed on to you for a compliance review, you need to know when the project is done, when your role is finished, what you have to do, and whether you need to go to regular meetings, and are you going to be involved? Are you going to be asked once and then ignored? Are you going to be involved in the process, and what is the completion of your role? And if it's a major project, will you be part of celebrating the completion of that project? And at the end of a project, what went well, what didn't go well, what you need to do to improve. The hardest thing is trying to make the business happy, perhaps. or making sure the business understands what you're doing. Sometimes the business will complain that perhaps compliance is a wet blanket, that it's negative, and so perhaps some of the things you need to do is to say, well, can you help? What can you help with? What are you working on? Identifying issues proactively and explaining what compliance issues might be coming up for them. Sometimes you'll have to challenge what the business is doing if they're doing something that is going to be risky, and you'll need to constantly look at risk issues. If there's a new venture being talked about outside your organisation's expertise, contribute to that. If there's some outsourcing going on, you need to make sure there's some controls involved in that. And it needn't be expensive. It can be efficient. As I said, I think that with high volume, low cost work, perhaps it can be done by the business, or it can be done in an automated way. I talk about business self-service. Perhaps marketing should take on perhaps a bigger role in compliance. I don't know what they do now within your organisation, rather than immediately sending it to compliance. Certainly with credit, they should be looking at matters after they're completed to see if there's any defects that have come. There should be what they call hindsight reviews, and compliance should be part of that. And internal training from compliance to those sections can help, so that they, rather than complaining about compliance, they can take on some of the responsibility. And that should be, as I said, part of the job description. And if there's an issue, if there's a risk that occurs, then it can be escalated up to the second line of defence. And there are a range, again, of cost-effective tools that can be used for those purposes. Things that cost nothing, and I think are an important thing, part of the communication process, is to do a board presentation, talk to senior managers, and if they don't have a compliance function within their section, to say, well, what are they doing to promote compliance, and ask them for feedback on what needs to be done. You need to talk to third-party providers to make sure they understand what your compliance obligations are. Perhaps talk to staff meetings, put something in a staff newsletter or intranet, and even, depending on the size of your organisation, walk around the different sections, visit a branch. I've certainly have gone to clients and I visited branches, and I see that the brochures they have aren't up to date. I haven't seen offensive pictures, but if you see offensive pictures, you should be noting that. But I see some of the material of branches isn't always up to date, and there'll be things that you might spot that should be attended to. Sometimes it's important to do an exit interview with a staff member, because it may well be that, depending on the circumstances, it may well be that they're leaving with some compliance concerns. So there should be some way of identifying those issues. There should be, and whistleblowers are a major issue and a growing issue. Perhaps there should be suggestions or a concerns box, either physical or online, for people to anonymously make suggestions or observations. Any questions there?
Not yet, but for about 10 minutes.
Okay. So that. Okay. So I'll try and get along so that we've got some time for questions. And there should be breaches should be disciplined, as I've said before, and training attendance should be taken into account in performance reviews and bonuses and promotions. Governance is a really important thing, so that the compliance is relevant to the CEO, senior managers, and it becomes a board. Compliance must be a board agenda item, and it's not just a matter of giving information about change the rules, but perhaps you can provide some metrics to show the number of current matters you've got, the types of matters, how long it's taking you to do them. So you've actually got some evidence of how responsive you are, how timely you are, how snowed under you are, what resources you need. So there's got to be some alignment between what you're doing, what compliance is doing, and the rest of the organisation. There's got to be a communications bridge. So it's essentially a matter of what compliance can do and demonstrating it, and not just saying, well, this is risky. You need to say, well, yes, there are matters of uncertainty. These are the uncertain factors. Let's sort of assess the risks and make a decision. There's a range of needs, being responsive, being accessible, and I'll let you have a look at some of those slides later on as to what you can do to bridge the gap with the business. You need to provide a commitment to help, sometimes understand their point of view and deal with unexpected changes. Be proactive, deal with the abundance of information. Sometimes there's ways you can deliver it either in chunks, smaller bits, or just, as I said, relevant to their particular job. And sometimes businesses know they've got a problem, so certainly if there's illegal conduct, you've got to, as compliance, have to stop that. But otherwise, there's ways that you can look at what they're doing and help them enhance something that the business is doing and add value. And identify things that are coming up in the future they should be planning for. So as I said, measure compliance effectiveness, reduce risks, reduce rework. If you can help the business by streamlining processes or showing where they don't need to do things again, that can help. And there are, again, a number of tools that have time recording, not necessarily to track people as a punitive measure, but actually to monitor and say, well, how long we're spending this amount of time on these work types, and that's because procedures aren't being followed or documents aren't being done properly, and that's a useful tool. So compliance, you've never got a perfect compliance program. Rules change and your framework will evolve, sometimes slowly. Technology can be used, but I think behaviour and culture is as important, and looking at the big picture. Certainly easy wins first are a great achievement. What provides most value, and that is a great goal. As I said, constant regulatory changes need a strong compliance program, but I think you need to look at ways that you can engage with the business, better processes, better project management, and actually have some metrics to show what you're doing, and that can be shown to the senior managers and the board. Well, I hope that's been useful so far. I don't know if there was any particular insights that were an aha moment, but what I'd like to move on to now are some questions, and you can, there is on your screen the questions tool if you want to send any questions, and so it's your opportunity to do that. Any questions? No questions?
There's one. What technology have you seen work well?
What technology? Look, technology is really interesting. I've seen a range of technology, both in terms of project management. So I've used myself, for a number of years I used something called Basecamp, which is effectively an extranet, but I've also seen more recent ones from, there's an Australian company called Atlassian, which is a huge company now, which has a product called Jira, which is a, I mentioned before, a project management tool, and Atlassian also owns Trello, which is the one I showed you before, which had the monitoring the progress of items, ticketing items, and who's doing what. Now, some of those tools, you don't need to worry about security in the sense that there'll be no confidential information, I would have thought, provided on some of those things. They're more of a project management tool. But intranets extranets, I used to use a wiki in terms of having information for compliance issues like a database. You can have that internally installed, and it's available through your internal browser. If you've got an intranet, if you've got a enterprise risk management system, some of those work well. I have to say that some of them are good in the sense that they will diarise to do things like deliver reports, and the problem is if you're a small organisation, at the end of the month you'll have 50 emails coming to you saying, have you done this, have you done that? So I've seen some frustration occur with that sort of technology, and it's a lot of technology is what you put into it is what you get out of it in terms of rules and assumptions. But it can be as simple as Outlook reminders going up to Excel spreadsheets to some of the more web-based things, and there are lots of now apps around, as I said, in terms of autoresponders, in terms of there are things now called bots, which can ask very simple questions and you get a very simple automated answer. So there's a range of things that are available and can deal with quite run-of-the-mill business questions. Anything else?
There's the questions that someone sent prior. They want that discussed, or there's another one below that.
Yeah, look, I know there's questions in terms of reporting and in terms of how do, I think one of the questions was that I got before was if a compliance person is in the business, do they have to report to the Chief Risk Officer or do they report to their business head? And I think, as I was saying before, it comes back to your organisation chart. It comes back to what the person is doing. I think the first issue is that if someone is in the business, then it's a business responsibility, and as I said, the business is the first line of defence. So in terms of reporting of compliance issues, if someone's doing a number of roles in the business itself and this compliance issue comes up, they can report up the chain in terms of the business, but they should also copy it to the compliance person or the Chief Risk Officer. And I think that that's one of the issues where the responsible managers come in, because the responsible managers have a role as well in making sure that they understand or they're aware of compliance issues that come up within their business division. So I don't think there's any hard and fast rules, depending on the size of the organisation. Certainly if someone's in the second line of defence, they're in internal audit, then they will report up to the Chief Risk Officer or to the Risk Committee. But it depends on what role a person carries out. And the same applies to who does what. So the issue is, well, who does process reviews, who does the reports? It really depends on the size of your organisation. And I've seen, quite honestly, I've seen in an organisation where a person who's the compliance officer was also, when they went out to branches, did internal audit functions. So they checked the balance of the cash, as well as looking for compliance, other true compliance issues. So people can fulfill a number of different roles, as long as it's documented. I think the key is that you have a process, you have it documented, so you know who is doing or who is responsible for what, and it can be audited and checked and see whether or not that process is effective, because part of the third line of defence is to review your framework and review how it's been going and whether it's been effective. So I think I'll come back. The person who asked that question, I can give them a bit more detail too, but that's the broad answer to that. What was the other question there?
How do you balance the compliance doing to the reporting compliance? I find managers ask you to report when you are doing and vice versa. Yes,
yeah, that's the question is, well, how, someone's trying to do the business as usual, do the compliance and do the reporting. and you end up with a cycle where you have a monthly cycle of reporting up, and then you'll have an annual attestations, as well as actually doing the work. And I think that comes back to the issue of prioritising, delegating. Look at what is important, some of those business as usual things. What is important, can it be delegated, can it be postponed, look at when it's going to be done. But some of the reporting things I think can be automated in terms of, if you look at some of those tools I've mentioned, or other tools that are around, you can actually get them to produce not necessarily a report in your exact format, but can take, if you record all the things you've done in a month on some of those things, whether a time recording thing, tool, or a spreadsheet. I've seen some where you actually just enter things as you go along. Then at the end of the month, it will produce a list of what they were. You can name them as to what, which division they came from, how long it took, and then perhaps you can add, whether it was a complaint, or or something need to be escalated, and can be attached to a report. And I think I've seen some of those tools are quite effective at just taking the raw data that you have, if you've recorded it, and spitting out a report. But as I said, it's a matter of looking at the work that you're doing now and saying, well, do you really need to do that? Can it be done another way? And also looking at the reporting and say, well, can I do that more effectively? Because I suspect a lot of reporting perhaps isn't analytical, it's just straightforward reporting. How many matters you had in the month, how many complaints you received, how many things were reviewed, how long it took, and there's plenty of tools that will do that. I think that's our time, but no more questions, so I think I'll call it a day. I thank you for attending, and yes, you will get an email with a link to the replay. So I'm hopefully that the replay and all the technology worked, and you will get that, and I'm hoping that you found it useful. I will send you out a short survey, just ask you whether it was useful or not, but I certainly thank you for your time, and thank you for attending, and I'll look forward to, if there's any other questions you have, please let me know. Thank you. So I'll just stop recording. And